Commodification of non-human animal suffering is an enduring feature of both modern wildlife management and colonial practices, particularly through organized hunting. And in the neoliberal context of public-private partnerships, animal suffering has been increasingly framed as a necessary element of environmental stewardship, especially when controlling invasive species. One prominent example of this is the hunting of Burmese pythons in Florida. At the same time, this commodification echoes earlier practices from European colonial hunting during the 19th and 20th century, where the killing of animals symbolized dominance, civilization, and economic exploitation. Now, I contend that the commodification of animal suffering in the guise of environmental conservation reveals deep-rooted ideological commitments to colonialist, capitalist, and patriarchal structures. Organized hunting, whether in the Everglades or on the African savanna, reflects broader socio-political dynamics of domination. Public-private partnerships have become central to neoliberal management of public goods, including environmental conservation. In Florida, P3s are integral in wildlife management strategies aimed at reducing Burmese python population. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the FWC, has organized events like the annual Python Challenge, where participants, often ordinary folks, are incentivized with cash prizes to kill as many pythons as possible. Over the past decade, these state-sponsored hunts have drawn media attention and significant public participation. The commodification of animal sufferings through these hunts reflect Nicole Shulkin's concept of animal capital, in which animals are commodified both materially and ideologically. Pythons are not just killed to protect the ecosystem, their deaths are turned into marketable competitive events that generate profits through tourism, media attention, and sponsorships. Participants in these hunts are celebrated as environmental heroes, further embedding the commodification of animal suffering within a neoliberal capitalist framework that prioritizes human gain over animal welfare. In media coverage, hunters are depicted as protectors of the Everglades, fighting with an ecological threat. Now, such narratives obscure the suffering of pythons themselves, instead emphasizing the heroism of the human participants, thus turning the act of killing into a spectacle. This practice can be understood through the lens of capitalist exploitation, in that neoliberal governance frameworks often lead to the privatization of public goods and the extraction of profit from nature. The Python Challenge, while framed as a public service, creates financial incentives for the extermination of animals and transforms environmental conservation into a profitable industry. This mirrors colonial hunting practices, where animals were commodified not only as a resource for food, but also for trophies and symbols of European conquest. The discourse surrounding the python hunting is deeply tied to narratives of colonialism, capitalism, and masculinity, just as European hunting in Africa or parts of Asia during the colonial period. As Adams long ago explained to us, the exploitation of animals is often intertwined with patriarchal structures that celebrate the domination of nature as a demonstration of masculine power. The Python Challenge promotes a similar narrative, where hunters are portrayed as courageous and skillful men venturing into the dangerous Everglades to save the ecosystem, echoing the colonial image of white European hunter who is celebrated for his ability to dominate and subdue the wild landscapes and its animals. In colonial Africa and in parts of Asia, large game hunting became a symbol of European male dominance and superiority. As Sorensen theorizes, colonial hunting expeditions were framed as adventurous rites of passage, where European men demonstrated their virility by killing dangerous animals like lions and elephants. The image of the hunter as a civilizing force taming the wild also reinforced colonial hierarchies, where European control both over the land and indigenous populations was justified by the notion of bringing order to a supposedly chaotic wilderness. The masculinist framing of the Python challenge is underscored by media reports that emphasize the bravery and prowess of male hunters. This rhetoric positions hunters as defenders of civilization, much like the colonial era hunters, and reinforces the idea that male dominance over nature is both necessary and virtuous. Capitalism further reinforces these masculinist and colonialist narratives, as the commodification of non-human animals through hunting is tied to broader economic structures of exploitation. In both the Python challenge and colonial hunting expeditions, the killing of animals is not just an act of control over nature, but it's also an economic activity. In Florida, hunters receive cash prizes and, in some cases, contracts from private companies to remove pythons. In colonial Africa, the exploitation of wildlife for trophies, such as ivory and fur, was a lucrative business, and the European hunters and the colonial governments profiting from the commodification of Africa's animal populations. Now, Nybert's work on the connection between capitalism and colonialism and the exploitation of animals demonstrates that the commodification of animals, whether for sport or for profit or for conservation, is inherently tied to capitalist systems of domination. In colonial Africa, this domination was justified by the narrative of European superiority, where animals were viewed as obstacles to be overcome in the expansion of empire. In Florida, the narratives of invasive species management serves a similar function, framing the killing of pythons as a necessary intervention to protect the environment while obscuring the underlying economic incentives driving the practice. Sorensen critiques the contemporary wildlife management practices, particularly those involving invasive species, as reflective of colonial mindsets that frame non-human animals as intruders or threats to be eradicated. He contends that the narrative of invasive species often mirrors colonial discourses that portrayed indigenous populations and animals as wild and in need of control. In the case of the pythons, the framing of these animals as dangerous invaders reinforces an anthropocentric worldview where non-human animals are seen as disposable when they conflict with human interests. This narrative is further problematized by the fact that the introduction of pythons into Florida's ecosystem was itself a result of human actions, specifically the exotic pet trade. The irony, the very people now celebrated for killing pythons are the same demographic that fuels the demand for exotic pets. And this reflects broader patterns of colonial exploitation where human actions disrupt ecosystems and then justify further violence in the name of restoration or control. The framing of non-human animals as dangerous beasts or wildlife nuisances has long been a tactic used to justify their extermination, both in the colonial context and in contemporary wildlife management. In Florida, the pythons were initially seen as a curiosity, with media reports in the early 2000s depicting these animals as exotic, mysterious creatures that added to the allure of the Everglades. However, as their population grew and their impact on native species became more apparent, their narrative shifted. Pythons were reframed as invasive predators, threatening the Everglades, and lethal control measures such as the Python Challenge were introduced as necessary interventions to protect the environment. The shift in narrative is not, of course, unique to Florida. Similar patterns can be seen elsewhere, wherever European settlers have initially marveled at the diversity of the wildlife, seeing animals like lions or elephants or buffalo as symbols of an untamed wilderness. However, as European settlement expanded and wildlife began to conflict with agricultural and industrial development, these animals were increasingly framed as dangerous nuisances that needed to be eradicated to protect settlers and their livelihoods. The framing of the African wildlife as dangerous or out of place served to justify large-scale hunting and extermination efforts, positioning Europeans as protectors of civilization. Some of Algona's recent research on the social construction of pests offers insight to how this framing of animals as nuisances or threats is often a politically motivated process designed to legitimate their extermination. In the case of the Burmese pythons, their classification as an invasive species allows for their killing to be framed as an act of environmental stewardship, even when the circumstances that led to their introduction in Florida, such as the exotic pet trade, are themselves products of human economic activity. This narrative framing not only justifies violence, but also reinforces anthropocentric and colonialist worldviews, where non-human animals are seen as expendable when they conflict with human interests. In both Florida and in colonial Africa or Asia, the narrative of the dangerous beast or the wildlife nuisance serves to absolve humans of responsibility for environmental disruptions that we cause, while positioning the extermination of animals as necessary for the greater good. The commodification of non-human animal suffering continues to evolve, with the Python challenge serving as both a competitive event and a commercial enterprise. The expansion of the python hunting industry, driven by both state and private interests, mirrors the colonial exploitation of wildlife, where the killing of animals becomes both a public spectacle and a source for profit. The commodification of non-human animal suffering, whether in the context of Burmese python hunting in Florida or colonial hunting elsewhere in the world, reflects broader societal attitudes toward nature, animals, and masculinity. In both cases, the killing of animals is framed as a historic and a necessary act, justified by narratives of environmental stewardship or colonial conquest. These narratives not only commodify animal suffering, but reinforce ideologies of human dominance and masculine control over nature. By examining the parallels between python hunting in Florida and colonial hunting, it becomes clear that the commodification of non-human animals' lives is deeply tied to capitalist, colonial, and patriarchal structures, whether through public-private partnerships in the neoliberal era or in colonial expansion in the 19th and 20th century. The killing of animals served as both an ideological justification for violence and a celebration of human cruelty. To move forward more ethical and sustainable wildlife management practices, it's really essential for us to challenge these narratives and to consider the ways in which non-human animals are framed and treated both within contemporary and historical contexts. Thank you.
Welcome to my presentation titled Capitalism, Speciesism, Colonialism, and the Absent Referent, a system that fueled the capture and captivity of Sk'aliCh'elh-tenaut, otherwise known as Tokate, Toki, and Lolita. My name is Gillian Walters. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Transformative Studies PhD program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I live and work from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional territory of the Sonoma First Nation. My doctoral research uses a trauma-informed intersectional vegan feminist lens to explore women vegan animal activists' experiences of trauma and healing. Today, I am presenting the paper I wrote for my final research course. Growing up on the west coast of Canada, I have a deep spiritual connection to the ocean, specifically to orcas. In 1985, my first introduction to an orca was at Sealand of the Pacific. I snapped these photos and remember feeling a mix of excitement and confusion. I could not articulate at the time my feelings of seeing such a big animal swimming circles in a tiny tank. I would not learn the truth about Tilikum until many years later. It was a combination of being a single mother and watching the documentary Blackfish that initiated my activism. The scenes of Tilikum's mother screaming and chasing her baby as he was kidnapped that filled me with so much rage and anger that I had to act. I immediately got involved with the local animal activist actions at the Vancouver Aquarium. Over the next few years, I, with many other activists, and many of whom who had been committed to the cause for decades before me, had a role in passing a ban to end cetacean captivity at the Vancouver Aquarium. This historical bill was passed in May 2017. Soon after, June 2019, Bill S-203 was passed that prohibits the taking or exporting of cetaceans in Canada. During this campaign, I got a front row seat to the depths of lies that capitalism and speciesism, the Vancouver Aquarium and staff, perpetuated about whales in order to reap the profits. This embodied experience of injustice and my spiritual connection to orcas fueled this paper. I wondered what would make humans need to violently kidnap, torture, and hold captive the orca, the most culturally sophisticated species on our planet. And how could the hundreds of thousands of humans who encountered her in that tiny pool not get a felt sense of the injustice? This presentation explores these questions. Using the concept of the absent referent, I explain how, as a society, we have been complicit. I argue that to understand the barbaric kidnapping of Toki, one must understand the historical intersections of capitalism, speciesism, colonialism, and the role of the absent referent. In the summer of 1970, 3 orca pods, the J, K, and L, joyfully gathered for a superpod event. Hundreds gathered to build relationships, frolic, and share food. The beautiful event turned to tragedy. It was called the Pen Cove Roundup. On August 8th, men used spotter planes, speeding boats, exploding bombs, harpoon guns, tranquilizer darts, and Persian nets to violently corral the orcas into Pen Cove. They purposely separated mothers from their calves. One woman wrote about witnessing it as a child. It was wrong, it was horrible, and we knew we were too small to do anything about it. Another writes, everybody I talked to about the event remembers the sound. It was wailing. It made you aware they could feel it. 80 individual orcas were encircled that day. 5 baby orcas drowned in the nets. To hide this horror, the men cut open their bellies and filled them with rocks so they would secretly sink to the bottom. 7 baby orcas were shipped to various aquariums across the world. A 4-year-old calf was sold to Seaquarium for $20,000 and given the name Tokate, or Toki. When they placed her with the older male orca, Hugo, they advertised them as a husband and wife and gave Toki her new stage name, Lolita. After 10 years of performing, Hugo killed himself by repeatedly banging his head against the wall of the tank. This left Toki alone for decades. Toki would spend over 50 years performing tricks in the smallest concrete tank in North America. She was deemed the loneliest orca. Her 20-foot-long body, capable of swimming hundreds of miles a day, was crammed into an 80-foot by 30-foot tank deemed illegal under the Animal Welfare Act. Her enclosure was just a few hundred feet from the ocean. Speciesism is a concept originally coined by Ryder and was popularized by Singer. It is defined as a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. Speciesism is clearly evident in this story, from the initial kidnapping, confinement, and refusal to hear activists and whale experts pleas to release Toki. Capitalism. Under capitalism, Toki is property of Miami Seaquarium. The Miami Seaquarium purposefully painted a picture, an inaccurate, misleading picture vastly different from the reality of her capture and captivity in order to sell tickets. The truth, of course, is there's nothing natural about what happened to her. The parallels between settler colonialism, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and the genocide of orcas is undeniable. Each step in the life experience of Toki reads like a page out of the colonizer's playbook. It begins with a premeditated and violent attack on a family by white men and the forced separation from mother and child, the deliberate kidnapping of the young who were easier to train and transport. This relocation away from family and culture resembles the experiences and trauma of the residential schools. The Sk'aliCh'elh-tenaut, a location so completely foreign from her natural home, erased her culture and her ability to swim free and communicate in her language. Guernsey, Keeler, and Julius write, just as human kin were stolen from their homes for re-education and put on display as a show of white cultural superiority, so too are other than human kin put on display as a show of superiority in conservation work. She is renamed a settler name, Lolita, formally disconnecting any connection to her human kin, the Lumi Nation. Her body is exploited and put on display through live entertainment. Her image is replicated and sold through photos and film, paralleling how Indigenous children were exploited after stripping them of their culture and language. Her image and false identity are sold to the masses to perpetuate a narrative that orcas are objects for humans. In a letter from the Lumi Nation to Miami-Dade in 2021, they write, "We are taught that the southern resident orcas of the Salish Sea are our relatives. We are from the side of the family that lives on the land. She is from the side of the family that lives underwater. She is our relative, and we love her and want to care for her as we would a sister, daughter, auntie." The absent referent is a term coined by Carol Adams to explain how animals disappear, that space that exists between the living animal and the dead meat. The function of the absent referent is to keep separate any idea that she or he was once an animal. So in Toki's case, the first is the literal sense. A false narrative is conceived that supports the absent referent. For example, a 4-year-old southern resident orca calf is violently ripped from family lineage, mother, father, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles below the sea and on the land. The aquarium does not disclose the facts of her kidnapping. She is now Lolita, the friendly and docile killer whale, happy to please human audiences by splashing and jumping. Sk'aliCh'elh-tenaut writes, "Be amazed and delighted by Lolita the killer whale as she shows off her grace and natural abilities." The second is through language. A 4-year-old orca calf is now Lolita, referencing the sexual predatory relationship of a middle-aged man, Humbert, against a 12-year-old girl, Dolores. In the book, Humbert strips Dolores of her name and calls her Lolita. For many years, activists, whale experts, and humans from all over the world fought to have Toki sent to a sanctuary. March 2023, preparations for moving Toki to a sanctuary were being planned. August 18th, 2023, Toki unexpectedly passed away just as she was on the verge of finding her way home. The Lumi Nation was able to bring her remains home and conducted a small, closed, sacred ceremony headed by spiritual leaders. The danger in institutionalizing animal exploitation under the guise of education and conservation perpetuates the idea that animals can be used and exploited for entertainment, and this pattern of subordination and degradation of a sentient being becomes part of our cultural DNA. It continues to, quote, detach us from life's sacred wells. Despite a growing movement to end cetacean captivity and entertainment, the public fascination with dolphins and whales continues to fuel the enthusiasm for visiting aquariums and theme parks. I propose an enthusiasm to seek a greater understanding of the similarities between species and the intersections of systems that oppress them. R.I.P. Sk'aliCh'elh-tenaut. Thank you.